Hello, everyone. Welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, Adventures in the Photography of Architecture, we are joined by Eric Lutz, the Associate Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the St. Louis Art Museum. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Eric.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk a bit about the new exhibition, Architectural Photography from the Collection, 1850 to 2000, which just opened about a month ago. It has a great range of material from ancient ruins taken in the early years of photography to modern skyscrapers in New York and suburban sprawl in California. So I want to start by showing a couple installation shots. Oops, there we go. I certainly encourage everyone to come see the exhibition in person if you can. The prints are absolutely gorgeous. But of course, it's entirely what you're comfortable with. But the show will be open through January 2nd, 2022. So another 5 months, so you have plenty of time. There are 85 works total in these two galleries by some 50 European and American photographers. So it's quite an expansive material. But I wanted to take this opportunity to really delve into a half a dozen works in the show in some depth to show different types of buildings, to show different reasons why photographers across a 150-year period were attracted to the built environment and the different kinds of approaches that they took. So we are going to start off in the English countryside with some ruins. This is an image by the English photographer Philip Henry de la Motte and his partner Joseph Kundell. And his image shows the remains of a very large abbey called the Fountains Abbey in the north of England. And this came relatively early in the history of photography that this image was taken, only about 15 years after it was invented around 1839. And what is on display in the show is a plate from the very first photographically illustrated folio of architectural subjects called A Photographic Tour Among the Abbeys of Yorkshire. And this is 1856. So really early in the history of photography. So generally in the 19th century, there was a very pronounced interest in ruins, both as an aspect of kind of the picturesque landscape and as a symbol of history, kind of representing the impermanence of our imprint on the world, that often buildings, have defined kind of life cycles. This interest in ruins kind of began growing in the late 1700s in the work of painters and poets and writers, and photographers kind of joined in that movement. And there was in particular a very strong interest in the Gothic style. The Gothic style that was prevalent in Europe, particularly in the late 13th and early 14th century. Most monasteries in Great Britain were built in this rather elaborate decorative Gothic style. One that is characteristic with these pointed arches that we see here. But many of the monasteries that were built had fallen into ruin in the early 16th century after King Henry VIII declared himself the head of the Church of England and had them dissolved. And so Fountains Abbey that we see here was one of those. The De la Motte's image is really dominated by this monumental stone arch at the end of the nave of the abbey that we see here. This arch is echoed by these smaller arched portals and altars on either side. And this motif of the opening, whether it's doorways, windows, structural supports, runs through much of the history of architectural photography. And these arches not only resonate with the rectangular frame of the photograph itself, but also serves to kind of pull the viewer's eye through the pictorial space of the photograph. Here, rather oddly, the window, almost seems to be kind of framing a void. Many of these early photographs have skies that are just kind of white because the film that was used was sort of oversensitive to blue, and so it sort of came out as this kind of bleached appearance. The rectangular frames, often are a threshold between indoor and outdoor, but without the roof on in this abbey. The roof was sort of dismantled after the monastery was decommissioned. What's interior and what's exterior actually becomes rather confusing. And I show on the right-hand side here an image of another abbey, the Holy Road Abbey in Scotland, which was included in one of the first known books that incorporated both photography and text at the same time, generated by a couple, William and Mary Howitt, which is also on display in the show. So before getting forward a little bit too much in this, I wanted to insert a little bit about process. Don't want to get too bogged down in process, but to indicate the extent to which architectural photography is, really a very specialized field. Not only do architects have to be very sensitive to qualities of light and form and structure, but they also have to kind of master different technical processes and very large, cumbersome cameras that they have to bring around with them. Most photographers over this period of 150 years used one form or another of what's called a large format field camera, a camera where a negative goes on one side and the lens goes on another, connected by bellows in between, and has a lot of adjustments that can be made for getting the right kind of perspective for these buildings. Sitting on tripod, often very heavy. So showing an older version on the left and sort of a newer version on the right. So just wanted to kind of put that seed in your mind that most of these images that we'll see were taken with large format cameras. So we are going to sort of jump across the pond here a little bit and look at a sort of a humbler example of religious architecture. This is a roadside church in South Carolina, taken by Walker Evans. So Walker Evans was actually born in St. Louis, lived here for 3.5 years, was one of the most significant American photographers of the 20th century. He really expanded the boundaries of photography by training his eye on sort of everyday architecture. Oops, apologize for that. Looking in sort of small towns, rural areas, What is that often called sort of vernacular architecture. And he emphasized the real kind of directness and sort of absence of pretense in his photography. Some of his compositions were very kind of spare, very direct, particularly of these roadside churches, which are one of his favored subjects over his lifetime. So this one in particular, the church is very small. It's marked, almost by kind of flimsy construction. But Evans, I think, really forcefully communicates the beauty that he discovers in its very simple design, and by extension, the kind of aspiration of the congregants who use this church. We have this absolutely kind of radiant light kind of streaming in at a diagonal from the left. And the building's form really rises from these almost impossibly thin portico supports here towards the peak of the bell tower, which is kind of animated by these decorative shingles. So it's the one place, where the designer of the building, kind of let decoration come into to the design. And in his very kind of rigorously frontal view, I think the building really kind of transcends its rather humble physical state to become something that in this photograph appears, almost monumental. So really a special work to have in the show. And this work appeared in Walker Evans' book called American Photographs from 1938, a real seminal publication in the history of architectural photography, with a number of other works. I show another example here from Atlanta of some sort of dilapidated Victorian houses. But photographers, even to this day, really use this book as kind of a blueprint, a template for work that they do, particularly in going out in the automobile and sort of exploring the American countryside and kind of making discoveries. Now to move further west and to consider photography of a brand new building. This one taken in Palm Springs, California, taken by the noted photographer Julius Shulman. Julius Shulman really helped spread the appreciation of California mid-century modernism through his very elegant and precise photography. I show two images here. These are taken of Richard Neutra's Miller House. Richard Neutra is a very prominent modernist architect who relocated to California. And this house was commissioned by St. Louis resident Grace Lewis Miller in 1936 as her winter residence, a nice place to escape to in the winter. Shulman's photographs document both the very kind of dramatic desert setting of the house and also its very specific modernist geometries. The interior of the living room and the screened porch here emphasize this kind of blurring of indoor and outdoor spaces. It's a very lightweight pavilion made of wood and stucco and glass, and the architecture actually starts to disappear in a way, whereas light and air and the surrounding nature side is sort of brought inside the house. Though one realizes, I think it's quite fascinating, in looking at these two views together, the house looks very large and expansive in the interior view, but in the exterior view, one realizes it's actually quite a diminutive sort of structure. The house on the image on the right also makes a particular sort of argument for the relationship of the house to the landscape, but one that is very carefully framed. for photography in general and architectural photography in particular. Sometimes it's just as important what you leave out as what you include. So Julia Schulman is standing on the road in front of the house. And there's another development just to the left of where he's cropped this frame. So one has the illusion that the house is entirely by itself in this sort of dramatic desert setting. But in fact, there's a lot of development around it. These two photographs, which were gifted to us by Stephen Leet, who wrote an entire book about this house, were taken just after the house's completion. And these are really unique examples of collaboration because the architect as well as the owner of the house were there with the photographer to collaborate on what they consider to be the best way of documenting the house, the best way of sort of describing the house, finding specific camera angles, arranging furniture within the house to present kind of an idealized lifestyle, a modernist lifestyle. So the house is fortunately still standing today. Many houses and buildings, in the exhibition have either been demolished or altered, but the surrounding landscape here has really been completely altered through development. So it would almost be unrecognizable today. Another building in California, going a little bit farther north, looking at San Francisco, is one by photographer Max Yavno. Not the sort of most recognizable name in photography, but quite well known in California, but really an extraordinary artist. So here he's focusing on apartment buildings that are adapted to the very characteristic kind of hilly terrain of San Francisco. And in his very kind of tight kind of geometric composition, he sort of balances these formal elements of windows and garage doors and the varied changes of the elevation. The building itself is rather unassuming. It's not by a known architect, but the image derives this very strong kind of visual power from the march of shadows that move at a diagonal across the surface of the image from right to left. Yavno was a very talented, very meticulous kind of printer. And this kind of rhythm of shadows is something that he really intensified through his work in the darkroom. And one of the things that I wanted to point out and included on a label in the show is the back of this this print in which he sort of kept all of the notes that he made in the darkroom about processes that he went through. A lot of what he wrote down had to do with different times that the image, parts of the image were exposed. So this really shows that what we're looking at in the photograph is, an artistic construction. It's not a transparent kind of document window out into the world, but really kind of a translation of a scene, an interpretation of a scene. And this is true really for all photographers, in this exhibition, that working between the three-dimensional form of architecture and the two-dimensional surface of the photograph, that there's always a lot going on, and it's always good to consider this kind of translation between these dimensions. And then we have an opportunity to focus our attention on St. Louis itself. We are looking at a building taken by the photographer John Zarkowski, who made a trip to St. Louis in 1955. This is a time when many of the older 19th century buildings in the waterfront area were being bought by the city with the intention of tearing them down in order to make way for the archway grounds and the highway kind of going through, paralleling the river in that area of town. So a number of photographers were sort of attracted to this older fabric of the city that they knew would be disappearing relatively quickly. Before I talk too much about the image, just wanted to give a little bit of background on the photographer, John Zarkowski, who specialized in 19th century commercial architecture in the Midwest, did a lot of work in Chicago in particularly. And he received a Guggenheim Fellowship, which resulted in the book, The Idea of Louis Sullivan from 1956. And we have a spectacular example of Louis Sullivan's work downtown that's still standing, the Wainwright Building. This is considered to be sort of the first skyscraper with a very unified kind of aesthetic design. I like this image by Zarkowski because it shows the building very much in daily use, you know, with the air conditioners and the blinds and different arrangements. You know, really admitting that buildings have this, you know, very specific daily life to them. But back to this image, I think Zarkowski was very much attracted to these large expanses of floor-to-ceiling glass, which is made possible by the cast iron facade. And so, you know, because the iron did all the supporting, you know, the glass could fill in everywhere else, as opposed to, say, you know, a brick facade. The facade and the building were made in 1873. So shortly after the construction of the East Bridge, which is about a block away from where this picture was taken. The facade itself was made by the Polis brothers, which were a St. Louis firm. I think there were about 10 firms actively making cast iron facades, but very few such examples remain in the waterfront area today. And the building that we see here was actually demolished shortly after Zarkowski took the picture. So there's a real sort of understated elegance to Zarkowski's photograph. He took the unusual step, I think, of sort of framing the plane of the facade of the building a little bit off parallel with the camera. And opening up just a little bit of space, a little bit of air that kind of pulls the viewer's eye around the corner. And the result are these wonderful kind of diagonals of the planes of the windows, ranging from the reflectiveness of the windows here to the transparency of the windows behind. Of course, the fact that this was a corner building, you know, meant that there was going to be a lot more light coming into the building, but also the fact that the building was completely emptied out of furniture and not being used at the time that this was taken. One can actually see a for rent sign here in the window. Means that Zarkowski was free to really focus on the structure and the volume of the building, almost in an abstract sense. That makes it quite unusual. But this emptiness of the building sort of forecasted its sort of imminent kind of doom, unfortunately, and as I said, the building was torn down shortly after the picture was taken. This photograph was accompanied when it was gifted to the museum by a letter from the photographer. Rather unusual thing for a photographer to sort of comment in depth upon a particular image. This was given to Kara McCarty, former decorative arts curator at the museum. And in the year 2000, near the end of his life, John Zarkowski wrote, This is the only print in existence, and it was made in the mid-1950s when I was at the top of my form and when papers were better. So it is unlikely that I will make a print as good again. I think it is a very good photograph of a wonderful building not far from the Eads Bridge, and it is my impression that it did not survive long after this picture. It was, of course, mostly luck, but I don't think I've ever made a photograph that described the building better. Those are great words to have to accompany this image. In doing a little bit of research, both about the history of the structure and what happened after the structure was demolished, I came across this image that was originally published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and then reposted recently, showing the general area of this building. Here is what was demolished for the arch grounds, which was being used as a parking lot in that period of time, 1956. And here we have what's called the Mark Twain Expressway that connects 44 with 70. So this is under construction. And a colleague of mine at the museum, Jason Gray, actually noted that this lamppost right here is the same lamppost that we see in front of the building. So this is the site at which that building had occupied just a few months earlier. So rather extraordinary to have a sort of photographic trail of the site of the building. Since this does touch upon the issue of historic preservation, I do want to mention just an absolutely invaluable resource that we have here in St. Louis. It's called the National Building Arts Center. The actual siting of it is just across the river in Sauget, Illinois, and had been led by a remarkable man named Larry Giles, who very sadly passed away recently. There's just a memorial service for him. But he spent much of his life salvaging remains of buildings from just absolutely gorgeous buildings in downtown St. Louis in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and many of which are sort of waiting to be kind of represented and rediscovered at the National Building Arts Center. So if anybody's interested, that's just a remarkable place. So I want to sort of finish up by jumping ahead to the world of color. Most of what we've been looking at so far has been in black and white, but a lot of photographers shifted over to color by the time we get to the 1980s, 1990s. And this is the most recent work that we have in the show, taken in 2002. It's a French photographer, Stéphane Couturier, who's looking at new suburban development in San Diego. And this is taken from the window of a house being erected, and Couturier being kind of fascinated by this rapid suburban development that's taken place in Southern California. So he constructs it so that the viewer's eye really moves through the multiple layers of the image, depicting different states of construction. So in the back, we have, sort of the desert that had been bulldozed, and then houses just beginning to be built, and then a couple houses here that are fully built, in fact, with their installons installed and the sprinklers going. So it's really, kind of fascinating to see these different kinds of development taking place. And I thought this would be a good sort of image to end with, since we started off kind of looking at these openings and windows and doorways with the Fountains Abbey. And here another kind of reiteration of how windows can resonate with the edges of the photographic frame themselves. But here, instead of looking towards a building, we're actually looking out of a building. And Couturier aligns the kind of raw wood casing of the window with the border of the photograph itself, in a sense, kind of conflating the window with the photograph. And making us aware that photography really always frames, what the camera is pointed at. And here the window almost becomes a stand-in for the aperture of the camera itself. So the idea of what we look out onto is as much a subject as the actual kind of built environment itself. And so just to pull a couple of the images together, just to think about different approaches that photographers have taken, different appearances, because of processes that the photographic prints assume, ways of thinking about the relationship of indoors and outdoors, ways of capturing, structures of different types of buildings. So I think I'm going to stop there after a half an hour and open it up to questions. Love to hear what people are thinking about and looking at some of these images. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have a few. So the first question is kind of a real big picture.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to pun there, but they ask, what should I be looking for to indicate that a photograph was taken well? Like, what distinguishes these works from an amateur's?
It's my job, and it's my joy to seek out the absolute best photographs that are made. I've probably looked at 500,000 photographs in my lifetime and building. And certainly many of the photographs that are on display are by very well-known photographers, really experts in their time period. So hopefully this the show sort of pulls together some of the best works that are made. I do think that it's a process of stopping and looking and engaging with the image and thinking about choices that photographers had to make in terms of finding different perspectives in which to communicate a building. And I really hope that this exhibition gives everyone the opportunity to think about all these choices that photographers had to make, and that many of these photographs are taken through very long considered opportunities by the photographers to find these perspectives and to join their own sort of trained eye with their experience using their equipment. For some of these photographs, it might involve a week-long journey in horses and carriages or with donkeys that their camera and negatives are loaded onto in order to get to a building. And many days, spent living with that building, trying to determine what the best lighting is and what the best angles are. And then taking the negatives back and working with them in the darkroom to produce, what they consider to be, one of the best, best possible views. So, in this day and age, it's very easy to take good pictures. With iPhones or different digital cameras. But there still is no substitute for a real consideration of spending time with buildings, and many of these photographers spent their entire lives thinking about architectural form, thinking about light, how light animates structure. So it's just a great learning opportunity to see, what some of the best, kind of eyes looking at architecture and different building types around the world are. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. So I know that this was a very small selection of what is actually in the show, but someone is asking about the number of female photographers that are represented in the entire show. So I don't know if you can speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. It is a field that has traditionally and still, to this day, been dominated, largely by male photographers. But there have been, some really interesting key figures throughout that history by women photographers. We have one from the 19th century, in which there were virtually no women photographers. A woman named Olivia Wittberg, who is a Swedish photographer, and it's just a lovely image of the inside, again, of another abbey that had been sort of left to ruin. So I'm sorry I don't have a picture easily to pull up here. The other photographer who's represented in some depth in the show by 3 images is Bernice Abbott, who had worked in Paris and been influenced by the work of Eugene Atget, who is famous for his kind of views of all the old sort of medieval streets in Paris. And then she came over and did the sprawling project of New York City called Changing New York in the 1930s, and took hundreds and hundreds of pictures of New York as it was, turning into the sort of modern metropolis that we know today. And then more recently, I think the most contemporary image that we have in the show is a German photographer, Candida Hofer, who worked with other Germans such as Thomas Struth, who we had on display at the museum a couple of years ago. And she's looking at an old church in Amsterdam. So we do have some good representation within the show. Unfortunately, because of copyright limitations, I wasn't able to show works by Bernice Abbott today. Otherwise I would have. But I'm very glad that you brought up that question.
That just means they have to go and see it in person.
Have to see in person.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got one last question here. Is there a difference between photographing sculptural works and architecture?
I would say that there are some really interesting overlapping concerns between the two, and that the photography of sculpture is its own kind of unique kind of genre, and that people have to think about qualities of light and how to communicate something that's meant to be experienced in the round. I often think that it's very useful to think as much about what photography can do as what photography can't do in a way. Most sculpture, like a building, is meant to be experienced, in the round. That we move through it. We see it in different lighting conditions. It's a visceral, physical experience. And so, finding one particular view that communicates, lighting and texture and form as sort of graphically compelling as possible is a real skill. But it's also up to the viewer, to realize that it's not a substitute for the real thing. What we're seeing here on the screen, are two-dimensional translations of three-dimensional form, and they are as much the visions of the photographer as they are communications of the actual space. it is something that I've certainly thought about in the past, how we rely on photography, as a surrogate for getting to know, a piece of sculpture, say that's in situ in Rome that we might never be able to get to. And so photographers can do their best, but it's always kind of mediated by the fact that that sculpture and architecture together, are meant to be experienced, as a human body that walks around and inhabits a particular space. So great question, love it.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. This was great. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. If you'd like, register to join me on Thursday, August 26th at noon to hear a presentation about the conservation treatment of the Garnsey murals in the museum's Gallery 203 by the conservation staff and interns who've been working on it all this summer. You can register for that program and more at slam.org/events. And thanks again, Eric, and thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Hope you come and see the show. Thank you.